I want to start talking about El Grito de Independencia. And I thought that since this is a festival that is based on an actual historical event, I could share with you a bit more about what El Grito de Dolores is. So to start talking about this specifically, I do need to talk about Miguel Hidalgo. Well, this is actually a moment of celebration. This is the El Grito de Independencia en el Zócalo Capitalino en la Ciudad de México. That wasn't definitely this year. We got a very different scene of Mexico yesterday because of COVID. But even in moments like this, when we're going through a lot of challenges as a community, just everywhere in the world, and definitely within the Latino community, I thought that it was valid to have a moment of celebration. I mean, everything, because indeed we celebrating something very important, which is our Mexican heritage, and that's a reason to be, really excited about and happy about. In the back of the image, you can see the cathedral. This is the center, just the downtown Mexico City, and the beautiful Mexican flag on one side of my face right there. So I did want to start with this image just to celebrate together. In the center of this image, you will see Miguel Hidalgo. I'm going to move a little bit to the side so you can see El Padre Hidalgo. And he's a very important person in this story that I'm sharing with you. Miguel Hidalgo was from Guanajuato, which is where the fight really started. He was a really, really interesting person. He was criollo. That's important to mention that. Criollo meaning his parents were Spaniard. He was born in Mexico. And as such, he had, talking about privilege, well, he had the privilege to go to school. He became a priest. That was a very, very good gig to have at that time. It allows you a very important place within the community because it gave you the platform to speak. And he was well known for being someone really honest, really muy valiente, very brave, to really point out issues that other people weren't talking about as much at that time. He spoke 7 languages, and that's very, very important about him. He obviously spoke Spanish. A lot of the priests at that time spoke Latin. In fact, masses were in Latin. Even at the time when my mom was a little girl in the 50s, if you went to hear mass, you had to hear it in Latin if you couldn't speak it. He spoke French fluently. He spoke Italian. He spoke Purepecha, which is an indigenous language, as well as Otomi, Nahuatl. He was the first person who created a translation of some of the very important works of Molière. He was an admirer of theater in particular. I'm a little jealous about the fact that I was in one of his parties. He used to hang out with people at the time that were like, rebellious, and that were talking about the possibility of like a change. I think that was very necessary. One of the reasons of why I like these images is that you can see the estandarte, which is on top of his head, with the image. I'm sure most people can recognize Guadalupe, which is, well, an image that actually once he started using to congregate people, it became very, very powerful. Most of the people who followed him during the first days after El Grito were indigenous, and that's very important to point out. Going back specifically to that night it was more like madrugada, sorry, the 16th of September, 1810. We celebrate that day usually on the 15th, but it seems that the reason for that is really strange, which is that Porfirio Diaz, who became president of Mexico many years after that, liked that day for the celebration because it was his birthday. So he got his wish he could have the celebration, this beautiful celebration for independence on his birthday. But officially, really start really early in the morning of the 16th of September 1810. There's some controversies and really interesting stories about what actually happened on that day and what he said. He didn't mention independence at that speech. There's agreement on that because there wasn't a concept of that idea at that time for him, even himself. In fact, he said, Viva Fernando VII, which was the king at that time. He was more looking forward and expressing the need to get rid of el mal gobierno. He said, muera el mal gobierno, dead to the bad government, but no specifically anything about independence itself. That came later. So after he leaves the small Pueblo de Dolores, where he gave El Grito, this calling to freedom, he head to this beautiful, beautiful town of Guanajuato. Probably didn't look that colorful at that time. Now it looks so stunning in this picture, which is one town that if you go to Mexico, you kind of have to go there. It's one of the most beautiful towns that I know in Mexico, which is located more towards the center of the country. And it's very important for him, and he was heading there for a specific reason, which is that he was trying to get some allies for this war of independence from the people working in the mines. This is a very, very rich area of Mexico. There were a lot of Spaniards living right there in this town at that time. And you know, people, when they knew that he was heading there, they were pretty scared. So he got an army, not really well organized, but people that were, you know, tired of 300 years of being controlled and treated really badly. And the mining areas were definitely one of the ones that were witness to some of the worst things happening at that time, like people, you know, being forced to work until they essentially die, people of all ages. And he knew that for his movement, it was very important to connect with them. Not that he didn't have enough people coming with him because they were already thousands, most of them indigenous, I mentioned. And then they start heading towards this beautiful place. When he gets to Guanajuato, many of the Spaniard families at that time start trying to find refuge in this place, which is called the Alhóndiga de Granaditas. The Alhóndiga de Granaditas was a building that had just been built recently. It was used very few years, and it was actually a granary. So that was the place where they, you know, decide to go to try to protect themselves from all these people coming directly into Guanajuato. So you can see the building on the back. There's small little windows, and there were people on the roof of that building. Probably 400, about 400. But they were entering Guanajuato at that time, thousands of people. Just really upset, carrying, you know, machetes. A lot of them were carrying machetes, just sticks, stones, getting ready to take the city. So they went there, and the way it was explained to me, that's at the band since I was in elementary school, was like some sort of act of heroism, you know, because they need to enter the building. And to be able to do that, they had to burn a really big door to it, which is not visible in this picture. Probably was on the side of the back. And there was someone who was called El Pipila, who attached a really big piece of stone to his back. That's the story I was told as a kid. And then he took a torch and burned the door. That's where the story finished, you know, for a kid of like 7 years old. But then when I learned what actually happened, it was really, really terrible. So there were like about 350 people inside, including men, women, kids, and they were just terrified. And people just went, you know, that's what can you expect with that when there's a society that having repressed for so long, there's so much anger. And as far as I know, every single person inside of this building was killed. And after that, uh, they also took through the streets and started looting the whole town. So at its time, uh, Miguel Hidalgo was criticized because he wasn't able to control this. He was traveling towards Guanajuato with some other military people who were actually also getting very upset about what's just happening in Guanajuato. But he is responsible. I say, there's nothing I can do about this. Somehow I need to take advantage of this energy that this is generating. And after that, after leaving Guanajuato, obviously, everybody knew about it. There was news about this event immediately in Mexico City and other capitals because he continued advancing, and he was definitely advancing towards the center of the country. That was his next step. So as he heading towards Mexico City, he stops in a place that is called Tres Cruces. Tres Cruces is just getting a lot closer to Mexico City. And which happened there is that even when, the royalistas, they were sending troops towards this area, just trying to avoid him entering to Mexico City, they were overwhelmed by just the amount of people that had already joined the cause. Along his path, he was doing things like opening jails. He also made a speech and started writing about the abolition of slavery. It's of my understanding that slavery was abolished before Mexico than it was here in the United States. So that's one of the reasons why some of the people were following him. He was also burning documents that had to be with all the debts that people were contracting. Because during the colony, well, I didn't mention this part, but like they were pretty heavy on people who weren't paying their taxes, So people who weren't paying to the crown, they were severely punished. There was physical punishment for not paying to the king. You could be from a very small population and still have to go through this. If you were really old, maybe the punishment would be as strong because they didn't want to kill you, but definitely it was a warning. And also, if you were younger, probably you would get more severe punishment. So that's one of the reasons why they joined. In fact, during this time when the Spaniards realized that things were getting out of control, one of the first things that they did was to cancel some of those tributos, these taxes. But it was definitely too late. People were already too angry, and they just continued in their path towards Mexico City. From this point, I want to just jump a little bit or very much into history, and just to bring you to the time at least 200 years before this was happening, 300 years before that happened, and just to talk about the place where they're heading to. And this image right here is representative of that. This was Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire 300 years before. This image in particular, I love it because it's called, es una tira de peregrinación. That's how it's called. And I believe this is made on skin of some animal, either that or papel mate, which is a very beautiful paper that still is made in Mexico, mainly for folk art, that is made out of bark paper. So basically is describing this group of people that are, as you can see, immigrants, essentially, coming from the north area of Mexico. And you can see the little steps. You notice that they are, in movement. The one on the front, you see is carrying something on his shoulders. He has a little sign on top of his head. Looks like a little tip. It's right there, the opposite, around the area. And he's the Tlatuani. Tlatuani means that this is the person who has the voice. He's the voice of the community. He is the leader. Those signs right there are describing that. And the people behind them are their important characters of the story, probably priests. They are leading their people towards a promised land. And it's really interesting in their mythology what this promised land is. Some researchers have been trying to find this place in an actual map, and there's no precise agreement about if this is an actual place or is simply part of their mythology. And this is a very interesting people who went through a lot of challenges to get where they were heading to, which was the center of the country, the Lake Texcoco. This was a group of people who became refugees and who had to pay tribute themselves to many communities around them. So they will be given permission by some groups just to stay around for a few months, probably a few days, and in exchange of that, pay tribute themselves and then keep heading towards the center because they're looking for a sign, which is the sign that their priests are telling them they need to find in order to create their center, or which was going to be their capital, Tenochtitlan, the center of their empire. So towards the end of the trip, they find this image of an eagle eating a snail in the middle of a little, you can see like some water right there on top of a nopal. And by the way, this image is what you see in the Mexican flag. I think it's really interesting that just right from that image, from that idea, you can see something that I think characterizes our culture and something that I think other cultures can learn about us as Mexicans, which is that we, even when we can feel fearful about our own history, we were taught since we were kids, elementary school, to face it. I'm saying that because, the foundation of this city is in 1315. And when you go to school as a 7-year-old in Mexico City, you start learning about that. I was really shocked because we had opportunity to live also in upstate New York. And I remember this event with so much clarity when we were in Stone Ridge, a beautiful town in upstate New York. And I took one of these pamphlets created for tourists. And it contained some description of the town, Stone Ridge. And I was just really shocked that the history started in the 18th century. And I was thinking like, well, what about everything else? Where's the history of the groups that live in those places? I'm not saying that history necessarily is taught in that way still in the United States, but definitely in that sense, I think that Mexico is way ahead. Still, there's a confrontation with the past, sometimes with a sense of understandable pride, but also as a way of moving through life, making honor to those who came before us. And you need to go far away to see that. So it's worth it to get into your own history or learn about it. Doesn't matter where you are from. This is one of my favorite images of this whole presentation, which is Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. These are two beautiful volcanoes Yeah. Maybe you can show at the end your beautiful tattoo, Arturo, of Isla Cihuatl, and Popocatépetl,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I have it tattooed
which are
right in my
these
arm.
beautiful volcanoes outside Mexico City. And I decide to give you this image because, well, that's one of the images that I have when I would wake up in the morning in my house in Mexico City. If I was lucky and the day was clear enough and we didn't have that much pollution, the image of these beautiful volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. Obviously, these two are Nahuatl names. This is an image that is in the Museo Nacional de Antropología. So again, if you go to Mexico City, you do have to go to that museum because it's just unbelievable. And once you are there, you will understand where you are. This is what Cortés, the conqueror, saw when he arrived, you know, more or less, when he arrived to the place that is actually called Paso de Cortés, which is in between the volcanoes. Probably he was further away, but he described in his Cartas de Relación some of the first documents that tell the history of the conquer from the perspective of the winner, of someone like him, which was obviously trying to praise himself and look good with the king of Spain about what he was experiencing. So this is a city that is in the middle of a lake. I'm gonna move a little bit to the side because I want you to see the center of the city. You can see that like a place where there's less people, which is called the Recinto Sagrado de Tenochtitlan. That was essentially the area for culto, for ceremony. It was the area for the gods, not for humans, not for regular Mexicas or Aztecs. Close to them, you could see different things. You could see juego de pelota, very common in different sites through Mexico, which characterize a really important aspect of the culture. Different versions of it depending on where you are. The Mayan have one kind of juego de pelota. Tenochtitlan was a different kind of juego de pelota. Close to that, el Recinto Sagrado, which is the very center of that island, you can see like an avenue that gets directly into that side. You will find also two schools, which were the Calmecac and the Tepochcali. Calmecac was the school for more for the royalty or for the high society. They were very defined social classes within the Mexica structure, social structure. So on the top of them, you have obviously the king, the family of the king. There were several princes around, and just people of that level had to have a specific kind of education. Everybody, by the way, all the boys in the city had to go to school. You couldn't choose, and you couldn't definitely do homeschooling. Your hijos need to go to either Calmecac or Tepochcali. Calmecac also included classes on astronomy, mathematics, linguistic. You had to learn a beautiful way to speak, which is when you read some of the texts that survive from times a little posterior to the conquer, written in Nahuatl, it's really beautiful to see how people engage with others when there are situations like litigations in which the indigenous are defending the right to have lands, for example. So that's one of the things that they learn in that school. And Tepochcali is more the school for the Macehuales. Macehuales were the people from the El Pueblo, you know, the rest of the people. So you learn a lot of skills with your hands, but either if you assist to one or the school of the other, you definitely have a military education. that was really heavy and very important part of their culture, are one of the reasons why they fell, more the actual Spaniard invasion itself. The Aztecs were really big, specifically in the culture with Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli had a temple in el Recinto Sagrado, which is one of the buildings in the center of the island. So I haven't talked about the island itself because that's a fascinating part of the story. This is another view from the city of Tenochtitlan. There were different avenues connecting, this is a city in the middle of a lake, just imagine that. And in fact, there's several lakes in that area. This is the Lake of Texcoco, and there was something particular about them, which is that there was like a different mineral content in the water. So it was described like, just imagine a valley with lakes of different colors. So they were little kind of like a greenish, some they were more blue. And these avenues will connect the city, the land, all the land around from the valley directly into the city. In the middle of the avenue, there was the aqueduct, because the water, you had to provide clean water for all the population, and it wasn't coming from the lake. That was water that was taken from far away. So there were 3 entrances into the city by foot, these avenues, and there was also could enter through canoes. There were hundreds or probably thousands of canoes coming into Tenochtitlan every single day to exchange wood. They were huge market. You will see scenes of that later on. And well, I want to tell you more about how they built this amazing place. I'm going to go back right there for a second. So to make this amazing place, they had a system of something called chinampas. Chinampas are some kind of sorts of islands that were built into the lake, which is fascinating. And you can see examples of that still in Mexican places like Xochimilco. Xochimilco, that's the name of the town. Really, really close to Mexico City. And that will be essentially part of the city because Mexico City is just so big. So what they did was to go to shallow areas of the lake and build sorts of beds, with branches, and then attach those to the bottom of the lake. So branches, and then using salt from the lake itself to put on top of that, and then they could grow on top of this system, which is called chinampa, which was an incredibly efficient way of growing. So instead of having 1 or 2 or 3 harvests of corn like in other parts of the country, they could have as much as seven cosechas, harvests of really important grain for them. And they could grow all kinds of things. So people were really well fed, and the city was really well, como se dice, trazada, really well organized with the streets that were exactly in a line. So you want to visit your friend Arturo or Liz, you will take your little canoe, and then you go and go to visit them in this very beautiful and efficient system. It's not like that anymore, unfortunately. I'm kind of feel jealous about the people who were able to witness that in particular. Moctezuma II was the emperor at that time. I like this image that I'm presenting here because this is part of the images that was found in some of the codices. Codices are the books that came just directly after the conquer, that were essentially describing what just had happened. So there were different frailes in charge of just gathering all this history. There's very important ones. One of my favorites is called Codice Florentino. It's a book that was defined, which title at that time was La verdadera historia de la Nueva España, something like that. And it's like a huge encyclopedia with really important information that have become one of the principal sources of information for everybody after this event. And the indigenous people themselves paint a lot of these illustrations. And those books, many of them were actually written in Nahuatl. That was the principal language. So they had a translation into all the Spanish, but that was definitely secondary. The center, the heart of those texts is Nahuatl, which I find really interesting because it talks to you about the fact that even when they were conquered, in some way the Spaniards were pushed to really try to understand what we're just going through by learning the language. And I think there's a lot of merit on them. A lot of them, in fact, defending the indigenous, like, you know, Bartolomé de las Casas. They really spoke about all the atrocities that were committed by the Spaniards during the conquer itself and also after the colony. So if it wasn't for them, we won't hear much about many of the things that happened. There were other ways to share that history among the communities themselves. I will talk about that a little later. This is a view of the Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco is one of the sister cities of Tenochtitlan. So you had in the center of this valley, the city of Tenochtitlan, but the Mexicas themselves as a group divided in different sister cities. So they were part of the same alliance, but there were also, they carry some independent, you know, decision making when it came about the life in the city. And this is a very, very famous market, which is called Tlatelolco, now part of Mexico City. And in one of the images, you see like this man who's carrying sort of like an abanico with something blue on his head. He's one of the person who was just taking a look just to be sure that people are not stealing anything. And you see the exchange of goods from all parts of the empire. So they extended a lot, the Aztecs. Just like any empire, they just had this ambitious idea of always expanding. They were expanding because they want more tribute, they want taxes, just as the Spaniards wanted that later. And they also wanted people to be sacrificed to feed their god with chilopostle. There's a lot of misunderstandings about the concept of sacrifice for them. I do want to point out that, well, they did a lot of sacrifice. They will sacrifice themselves also to their own gods. But as one of my early teachers in middle school mentioned, it's very different when you decide to use sacrifice to your god than when you go out around sacrificing people from other places. So that's one of the reasons of why Cortez found a lot of allies when he was about to enter the city, because of the tributes, and also a big component of that is that they were really tired of having to feed their ceremonies with chilopostle. People were in torture, you can give them. So it wasn't about humiliation. It's kind of interesting because when people were going to be sacrificed, they were treated with honor. So they were given some sorts of drug and they are gonna be killed, but there's no humiliation. There's a different concept. In fact, there's like this recognition that they are the ones who are gonna be feeding the sun. But that said, I don't think it was like really nice to get these guys to your town and take people to be sacrificed to their gods. So that was a big problem for them later on. Here, this is just an image that shows the Chinampas themselves. So you can see people building just building them. And then the part that is important to observe is that once you gather enough soil and then you keep adding more and more and more to the size, you can eventually build on top of it. So literally, they build their city in the middle of the lake. And not only the little, chinampas to grow their food, but at the end they were able to build really immense temples. That's one of the reasons that in Mexico City, you go to Zócalo, the image that we start with the beautiful scene of the fiesta with the flag, you will see that Palacio Nacional, which is a very long building where the El Grito is happening, the actual ceremony in commemoration of El Día de la Independencia. You can see that that building, among others, is kind of sinking because there's still water underneath Mexico City. That's a big problem when there's earthquakes because it moves and it moves a lot. Just another image of the chinampas, just because I think it's such a fascinating way of producing food. Incredibly efficient. So I wanted to have that one. So, well, so I just described to you a little bit what Tenochtitlan was, and now we do need to talk about Hernán Cortés, which was the conqueror. Hernán Cortés lived for a while. I mean, he was obviously originally from Spain, but then he also lived in Cuba and La Española, two of the Spaniard colonies. And at some point, he decided that he's gonna go into Mexico itself to start, the conquer. The first place that he goes to is which now is Cozumel, which is the Yucatan Peninsula. And he goes there for a specific reason. There were two people who were naufragos. I don't know how to translate that word, but there was a ship, there was an accident, some people fell from the ship or whatever, and they end up living in a Mayan community. This is in the Yucatan. And they became actually slaves of the Mayans. And therefore, the two of them learned Mayan. Somehow, Cortés knew about it, and he decided he was going to, before continuing his trip, he was more inland, that he was going to try to save these two guys. Jerónimo de Aguilar y Gonzalo Guerrero. Jerónimo de Aguilar decides to go with Cortés. Y Gonzalo Guerrero, who already had kids with a Mayan woman, he said, I'm staying here. I'm not going to go with you. And then they continue their trip towards Veracruz. Veracruz is very important because in this place is where Cortés decides to found the city, La Villa de la Veracruz, to make officially, to create a Spaniard city in the land of Mexico. And he got in troubles with that because obviously the governor in Cuba, Diego de Velázquez, didn't like the idea. And he was going to be later being prosecuted for that. After he goes to Veracruz, he goes to, well, there's different battles with small populations around that time. He has with him about 500 people, horses, probably 18 canyons, and bergantiles, which are the boats that are going through the coast, that are getting him a bit closer to the center of the country, and also dogs. So their technique basically to get people in their side, initially just to terrorize them. They have canyons, people haven't seen weapons, they haven't seen canyons. It's like a psychological warfare. They have armors, they are on top of the horses. People are really confused because they see the person on the horse and the horse itself as a unity. They think it's one being. By the way, don't think like Moctezuma, which you saw in the images previously, which was the emperor, didn't know about this. because the Aztecs had spies through their whole territory. So they had very clear what was going on. Not only that, but there's stories about Moctezuma having dreams about what was going to happen. And he's already talking with the magicians, with the shamans, saying that he needs interpretation for some of the nightmares that he's having. And there's many, many ones that he has. One of them is one of the temples, temple to Huitzilopochtli in Tenochtitlan. All of them, the southern is caught in flames without anyone starting, the fire itself. So like a magic event where one of the most important temples all of the southern is destroyed by fire. He has other ones. He sees a comet, which I believe is because this is like an actual event. There's like this premonition about Cometa Halley. I think it was the Cometa Halley at that time going through the sky. You can see that in the Codice Florentino, one of the codices that describe the early stages of the colony. There's other thing that he sees. At some point, they find like this bird in the lake that instead of having an eye has like something that looks like a mirror that is mirroring the whole firmament that they describe like as a monster. And so he's already aware that something is going to happen. And as I said, he's already talking with his shamans about it. But he decides, just in case, to start sending more and more people just to let them know, let him know what's going on with this guy that just arrived. So anyway, so when Cortez gets to a place called, well, now the state of Tabasco, he encounters someone that becomes very, very important with him. Her name was Malitzin. And I could spend probably another hour just talking about this extraordinary woman who I think in some way was misunderstood by history. Malitzin, there's not exactly information about where she actually was born, but she ended up in the state of Tabasco, probably because she was a slave and she was sold. Sold or given as a prize for a war. It was not uncommon in Mesoamerica, that area of the continent, that toward the ends of really big conflicts, different communities will exchange, different goods, and among them were usually women as well. So Cortez does in this area of Mexico, the same that he did in other places in the country, and then just to try to make him happy, so he's given this group of 20 women. Among them was Malitzin. Malitzin spoke Nahuatl and also spoke Mayan. One of the person, Jerónimo de Aguilar, which I mentioned before, spoke Mayan. So it's really interesting the way in which they communicated, because as you approach the center of Mexico, more and more people speak Nahuatl, which is still the language of millions of, more than 1 million of people in Mexico still speak Nahuatl. So that will happen is that Malinche will take information from the Tlatoanis, from the ones of the communities, the towns, which had the voice, that's what they're called Tlatoani, and then she will translate that to Jerónimo de Aguilar, to Mayan, and then he will in turn translate that and tell whatever they were saying in Spanish. So that's the word they were communicating. So in the moment that Cortez noticed that she can do that, she decides to just keep her by herself at all times. Malitzin, by the way, her name, the termination Tzin, T-Z-I-N, that's the way it's spelled, denotes respect. So if my name is Rodrigo, if someone calls me Rodriguitzin, that means that they have respect for me. It's like in Spanish when you say someone, don Don Arturo, Doña Liz. So that's the same idea. So this image that you see is really interesting because you can see sitting down Cortez. This is from some document from, very, very old document from the 16th century. It's called Lienzo de Tlaxcala, in which you see Cortez right there, and he's being offered tributes probably. And you see that, yeah, you can see different woods just underneath the page. So you see like animal, that probably those look like roasted chicken or something similar, probably turkeys. He was giving corn. And she's standing right there. And I just noticed that she's in the center. I mean, she looks actually bigger than Cortez. Cortez looked a little small compared to her. So she was really highly respected for, by many people at that time in some regions of Mexico. Tlaxcala is the place where Cortez heads later after contacting Malitzin. And along the way, he begins to establish alliances with many of the towns that were also tired of the domination by the Aztecs. Nothing of that could have been done without her participation, obviously. In Tlaxcala, there's actually a lot of talk just between the hierarchies, because they are trying to decide if they are gonna join the cause, and they're gonna go head towards Tenochtitlan, or if they are not going to do it, and at the end they decide to become allied with the Spaniards. They were enemies of the Aztecs forever. They were one of the only towns that were never defeated. They never gave tribute to the Aztecs. And they were seeing an opportunity to liberate from them. So they decide to join him. And then they headed to Cholula. Cholula is in just the outsides of Mexico. There's a beautiful church there and some important temples. Cholula was one of those towns that were actually allied with the Aztecs. But I would say the large majority of the communities around Tenochtitlan were actually enemies. So when Cortez reaches the city of Tenochtitlan, he has about 200,000 people from the Indigenous, which would join him. Probably about 800 Spaniards only. And then he heads towards the center. When he gets to Tenochtitlan, he's received actually like as a god. Along the way, like the Aztecs tried to persuade the Spaniards to go away in a very elegant way. They sent gifts to him, and that was also something that they would do. So when you give during those times when you give a gift to someone, it's not trying to say, hey, come, but all the opposite, like, please go away. So they send them gold. And as you can imagine, after receiving all these jewels from the different people that Moctezuma is sending, the last thing they want to do is to take off. So they continue their journey. Also, there's a part of the history that is really interesting that talks about this aspect of Mexico that I think is important to mention, which is that he was really actually, I'm sorry, just 1 second, let me turn this off. So just the fact, sorry about that. The fact that he knew that someone was coming, and he was already, as I mentioned, that he was trying to stop him either by giving him gifts, but also by sending sorcerers, magicians along his way. So he didn't reach the capital. But at some point, there's a group of magicians that leave Tenochtitlan to find Cortez. And well, they can't stop him. But along the way, they find a person who is just walking. He tells them, the magicians, like, what are you doing? Where are you heading to? Don't you realize that everything is lost? your city is gonna be destroyed. And then at that point, the magicians turn their eyes towards Tenochtitlan, and they see all the temples in flames. And that's the signal to them that it doesn't even make sense to go all the way to encounter with Cortés himself. They just need to go back to let that know to Moctezuma, the emperor. Since he knows that, there's nothing else he really can do at that point except for waiting. He, in fact, when he meets with people in the novelty, they are talking about if they should receive the Spaniards. And then he said, yes, we need to do that. And he knows that something is going to happen, but he knows that it's his destiny, and he needs to be there to receive Cortés. So Cortés is brought to the palace of Moctezuma. Let's put it this way, he knew what good service was. This was like an incredible palace. He had 1,000 people to serve him, all kind of people, like cooking for him, making sure that he was wearing the most beautiful clothing. I'm a little jealous, I need to say, about his buffets, you know, his breakfast or lunch, whatever you call them, because they describe that he had 300 dishes to choose from. And, you know, he had them set up for him, and he would just choose 30. I don't know who ate the rest, but I'm jealous about that part. And he also, like any other person in Tenochtitlan, they were extremely clean people. In fact, they were really surprised that the Europeans smelled really bad because they didn't. They would go to the lake and take several baths. They had a very sophisticated system, as I mentioned, through the aqueduct to bring water, also clean water, to the city. And he himself, he took at least five baths a day. Probably he needed help with that, I don't know. I know that once he finished his meal, he will ask his people who were serving him to bring him his pipe, and he will have some sacred tobacco. And then towards the end of the meal, he will have like a jicara. Arturo knows what a jicara is, which is like a little container made out of fruit in the form of a little bowl. And then he will have cocoa, no hot chocolate, but like foam cocoa, because that's the way they used to drink cocoa. This person right here, this is a really interesting part of the story. It's a mask done, and it has to be with a person who was involved in the colony and in the war of conquer itself. He was one of the responsible, a really important, unfortunate event in Templo Mayor, when the Aztecs were celebrating something really important, one of the more important ceremonies that involve a lot of dancing, that involve the making of a figure of Huitzilopochtli with amaranth, seeds of amaranth in a structure of wood. And was the reason of why the Aztecs suddenly realized that Cortés wasn't exactly a god. And that's where the actual fight started. So after that happened, the Spaniards need to actually just leave the city. They were living in the palace, and they don't have any other chance but to try to escape from Tenochtitlan. After that, the Spaniards decide to go to Tlaxcala, which is outside the city, and come back later with some bergantines that were built in Tlaxcala specifically to begin to do, which was called the Asedio of Tenochtitlan, meaning just literally starve people to death. So they closed the avenues, these entrances into the city that I mentioned. There were 3 of them. They destroyed the aqueduct. That was a big deal and caused a lot of suffering, for the people, for the population, and start also attacking with these bergantines, with these boats that they put together in the lake. They transport them from Tlaxcala through land, then they brought them all the way to the lake, and they start attacking also the city with boats. A lot of, obviously, thousands of people died in that fight. There was definitely a resistance. So in this image, you can see there's like this guy with a macana, like a shield, and he's wearing like one of those jaguar. These are part of the elite of the Aztec army. Those were one of the more brave warriors. You know, you need to consider again that there were 200,000 indigenous people fighting with Cortés. Something else that happened at that time is that they had, and now we're familiar with that, could be, unfortunately, they had viruela, you know, disease. And that's one of the reasons why they fell. So it took them a little while to, I mean, the city fell in the 13th of August of 1521. I didn't want to have this image because this one is of Cuauhtemoc. After Moctezuma is killed, he's substituted by Huitláhuac, which became the following leader of Tlatoani, remember, which is the one who has the voice. And after Huitláhuac died of viruela as well, this person, who is obviously seen as a hero, Cuauhtemoc, was the last defense of the empire. He was later brought to Cortés, and he told him, he was taken, you know, as captive, and he told Cortés, you know, I have done everything to defend my people, but there's nothing I can do, so you better kill me. So the people talk with so much respect still about this figure because he was one of the defenders of Tenochtitlan until the last days. And then after that, well, you know, that was essentially the surrender of Tenochtitlan. So after all that happened, well, Mexico became a colony. And they were essentially, the Spaniards tried to, in many ways, keep the social structure. They, by any means, wanted to start from zero. So, meaning that in many places, they allowed caciques, which were or Tlatoanis, to still be in charge of some sectors of the encomiendas, or the new economical organization, essentially. So if you participated in the colony and you were an Spaniard, you were given land and 500 people that you had to make work, you know, they became your property, essentially, in whatever means you needed to. And also they had to give tribute as well. So many of them didn't have to give tribute to the Aztec anymore, but they did have to give tribute to the Spaniards. And that happened for another 300 years too. Something which is interesting that I just want to briefly mention is that didn't happen with everybody. Some people, especially the ones that were in the nobility, including some of the family members of Moctezuma, ended up, for instance, living in Europe. Definitely the minority, but it does need to be said that some of them kept their status even during the colony, and their lands were respected, their property, their voice was respected. Something really interesting that happened, which I think is very significant, is that in the years after the colonization, with the Spaniards having as a job to have a registration of the experience of the colony, taught a lot of the indigenous people how to write, you know, the language, so the Nahuatl, because they didn't write it. And using these tools, they defend themselves in litigations. And they will directly, you know, send letters to the king in Spain, saying, "Oh, this was my land. This is what happened to me." So they were really proactive defending themselves. The frailes defend them, but they also defend themselves in court as well. So I just give you all the whole story because I thought it was very important to put in perspective some of the reasons of why a lot of people still in 1810, decide to join the fight against the Spaniards at that time, because somehow these memories of this event, they don't just disappear. They stay in people's hearts and consciousness, and either they hear them or probably they also feel them in their hearts and their bodies. So that's one of the reasons why they joined the fight for independence that triumphed actually in 1821 after 11 years. So my question will be, that I have been making myself, is how much really the situation after changed for the indigenous after even the independence. One of the things that happened, I'm just gonna close saying that, is that remember Malinche, that character that is very important because she is the interpreter of Cortés. In the 19th centuries, there was this movement to start talking with her in a very despective way and start seen as a traitor because she was the interpreter of Cortés. Interestingly, that started happening in a moment when the criollos, who actually start having the political control of the country, in some way were getting a little nervous that there was such a character of that caliber in the history, which actually was, first of all, a woman and also an indigenous woman. So you start disqualifying her. I don't think that's really fair, but that's a reason or something that we need to, I feel, reflect on. Yeah.
Well,
Arturo,
thank you so much.
To take it from there.
Bueno, pues just to say to everybody, I think it is really interesting to contextualize the past into, to the moment of the independence and the way that people fought, the way that they actually managed to create a large intersectional alliance, right? A coalition of indigenous people, criollos, people who wanted to change the government, people who didn't necessarily wanted to give the power to the less powerful, because as Rodrigo very well pointed, it's been over 500 years of colony, and the indigenous people are still marginalized all over Mexico, all across Mexico. So one thing that I wanted to point out is to contextualize it with the present day. There is something that I want to share with you, and this is what happened last night in Mexico City when Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, had to officiate the Grito de Independencia. This is generally an event that is attended by millions, like over 1 million people fit in the Zócalo of Mexico City, but yesterday was empty, right? So I want to take a moment to share this with you guys.
Mexicanas, mexicanos, ¡viva la independencia! ¡Viva Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla! ¡Viva José María Morelos y Pavón! ¡Viva Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez! ¡Viva Ignacio Allende! ¡Viva Leona Vicario! ¡Viva el heroico pueblo de México! ¡Vivan las comunidades indígenas! ¡Viva la grandeza cultural de México! ¡Viva la libertad! ¡Viva la justicia! ¡Viva la democracia! ¡Viva la igualdad! ¡Viva nuestra soberanía! ¡Viva la fraternidad universal! ¡Viva el amor al prójimo! ¡Viva la esperanza en el porvenir! ¡Viva México! ¡Viva México! ¡Viva México!
So as you can see, and now I can see you all. Thank you so much for showing your video for a second. This time, oh, hold on. This moment, this historic moment we're living through right now, calls upon us to acknowledge our voices and those voices of the people who have been oppressed for the longest time. I think that there's three phrases that AMLO adds to the regular cry of independencia, which is "Vivan nuestras comunidades indígenas." He is the first president to actually acknowledge the relevance of the indigenous people all across Mexico publicly like this. The second one is "Viva la fraternidad universal." Universal fraternity, right, which is a calling to love and respect each other no matter where we are in the world. And the last one, where his voice actually breaks, he's saying "Viva la esperanza en el futuro," right? Viva the hope for the future. And I think that this is just a call for us to don't surrender, to don't let go of hope. And I wanna ask Rodrigo and talk very briefly with him. We are a little over time, and we're gonna be finishing in the next. We're gonna be wrapping this up in the next 5 minutes. I just wanted to have a bit of a conversation with him. Yesterday we had a really interesting conversation about a couple of different points. The first one is just to contextualize for everybody who is joining us today that because the independence of Mexico was actually the independence of the Virreinato de la Nueva España, the Viceroyalty of the New Spain, and that comprised everything from California. Actually, yeah, I am in California right now, so we should be celebrating the independence of California today. Todo México, Guatemala, Belice, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, y Costa Rica. So all of these countries are part of, celebrate their independence on September 15th, because we were working and fighting together to become independent from the crown, the Spanish crown. The other important note that I wanted to say is this difference between the forms of colonization from the Spanish people with the colonization that the English people made. And this is because Rodrigo was mentioning that Bartolomé de las Casas was defending the rights of the indigenous people. Actually, there is a very interesting passage. It's a period of 4 years in which Bartolomé de las Casas goes to the Vatican to speak with the Pope. And he's arguing that the Spanish people cannot mistreat the indigenous people, that they cannot make them slaves, even though they were being pretty much enslaved. But he was arguing that they had a soul, and if the Spanish people harmed the indigenous people, they would be committing a sin. There was another priest in the Vatican that was actually arguing for the opposite. And after this period of 4 years, the Pope ruled that indigenous people, in fact, had a soul. They were, in fact, humans. And then they were supposed to be respected. And the difference is that the English people did not attach themselves to the Vatican and to the Vatican ruling, right? And that is why they exterminated basically the indigenous communities in North America and the United States and in Canada. Right, Rodrigo?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something that, I learned through all this process is that I think that the ones that deserve the most recognition for really holding to their traditions and making Mexico what it is are the indigenous, the indigenous population that have gone through really a lot. Discrimination from the beginning, that haven't actually finished. That's actually one of the reasons, in my opinion, of immigration as well. So you cannot just complain about the immigration of other people. That is so obviously something that needs to be pointed out, that we need to stand up and say, okay, this is wrong. When there's also all the discrimination and racism within the Mexican society that allowed, the levels of poverty that we have in Mexico and the need of people to emigrate because they don't have other choice. So I think that's something that we need to look at. During all this process, I really felt inspired by people like Miguel Leon Portilla. We were talking about him because we both have like a book of him. Here I have you have your Spanish version and I have my English version. The Broken Spears.
La visión de los vencidos.
Yeah, he just died last year. And I really love with how much love he talks about the indigenous communities and his very, his deep knowledge about the Aztecs in particular. He learned Nahuatl. So he was someone who, he had all these honoris causas from different institutions through the world, really, really respected, really good sense of humor, incredibly amazing just to hear him speak if you get a chance to. I hope there's something translated into English, or if you speak Spanish, it's such a pleasure just to hear him speak. I could speak, you hear him forever, and he focuses in aspects of the culture that I think that are very important. He really loved. He could just show off all of his knowledge. He has like this incredible memory of everything. But he focused at the end of his life in literature, specifically in Nahuatl literature. He's really knowledgeable. He has a lot of knowledge about that, and he dedicated to share not the parts of the Aztec culture that are more, like they'll sell more tickets because people get really impressed by the fact that did they have human sacrifice? But that other part of the culture, with their literature, with their poetry, their understanding of the world, and his work, anything that he writes, is something that if you are interested in learning more about Mexico, it seems to me like obliged lecture. Also, I do want to mention that, I just kind of remember through this work, something that I think that is very important. I was saying that at the beginning, which is that really memory is important. And I don't think that the way to go about with history is simply, there's time for reconciliation, and I understand that part. I don't think you go back to history to exacerbate anger or exacerbate like feelings about this oppression that actually happened. But I don't think it's a good way to go about it, either denying things that happened in the past. That's why I say that it does take some guts to go back into your history, whatever your history. It doesn't need to be your history as Mexican. It can be your history wherever you are from, or your own family history. We can learn a lot from that. And I do feel that we as a culture, as Mexicans, we have that to be kind of proud of, because we're still in contact with it. And there's teachers like Miguel Portilla, Leon Portilla, and many others, and whole institutions that remind us that we shouldn't forget. I remember the day when I became a US citizen. This is a funny story, just quickly. I became a US citizen a couple of years ago. And when I was right in Oakland in the ceremony, there was this woman selling US flags and Mexican flags. I thought it was very funny because you were in the US and somehow the message I got from that is like, okay, you're becoming part of this country, but you should never forget. I don't think that I needed that reminder, but I thought it was important as a message that you need to still be connected to your roots.
I think so. I think, and you know, I think that you're touching upon something that is really, really important. That is, there are a number of liberational movements that we're going through right now, very punctually naming Black Lives Matter. And you know, there is a lot of effervescence around galvanizing people, making a big coalition of people to go out and march. And I think that you touch upon something that is even a little radical. And this is, we need to dig into our history, not to exacerbate the anger. We need to make peace with the past, which is not to say forget, which is not to say not bring it to contextualize the present and the very specific conditions of inequity that exist in our society. However, I, as a mestizo from Mexico, I am part Indigenous, which I am very proud of. I am and I am also, you know, I have also heritage from colonizers. I'm also, you know, have people, my great grandfathers, I don't know to what degree they would come from Europe in a way. So if we focus so much on hating the colonizer, we will never recognize that there is a part of that colonizer that still lives within us. Right. Now, we can hate colonization and we can name colonization, we can try to heal from that. But if unless we make that peace with the past, we're not going to be able to make the peace with ourselves in order to start building a strong coalition that will offer dignity and justice for all, right? Rodrigo, I want to thank you so much for your time. I want to thank everybody for being with us. Just to remind people, FLACC is a community festival. We count on you, our community, to pass the voice, to give us a shout out anytime that you have an opportunity. Please do follow us on social media at FLACC20, FLACCDANZA. Woo. And go to our website. It's www.flaccdanza.org.